Good morning. This could be a talk on the psychology of children. It could be the talk on the psychology of adults, adultism, and the impact of the adult mind on the children's mind and the children's mind on the adult mind. We could play with all of that, and perhaps it will come out in today's talk. First of all, I'm going to show you an art piece just to get us into a deeper brain-mind connection, perhaps a little more right brain than left brain to get us started as I walk into this exploration on a very important topic about how we raise and socialize our children. Let's start with this art image, and it has two parts to it. Show you there for a moment. The art piece I did probably 6 months ago was sort of a buildup of the what's happening in the world of politics, particularly in the US, which is just south neighbors of ours, as I'm a Canadian. And I couldn't help but just recognizing patterns and patterns, watching publications that are coming out and noticing that the psychology of terrorism is something I've always been interested in, but now people are talking about the psychology of fascism, psychology of totalitarianism, and totalism, which is another whole psychology that Robert J. Lifton had introduced decades and decades ago. Someone who I really respect his existential psychiatry. Anyways, I'm not here to go into details of what all those mean. And if you want to ask more questions, I've named some names of different types of psychologies of, and therefore just drop me a note in the comment box that I'd be glad to elaborate on any of them if you're interested. But let's move on to what this talk is about. With that image, and then the thinking of what ends up happening is that image for me was capturing, you could see like a storyboard in a way of what is happening in the lives of children who are born in a post-COVID, now post-November 5th US new president regime. And we're going into a new era where everything is changing. So not only changing, transforming, breaking, collapsing, unknown. Imagine a child now, age 5, born, raised in 2020 onward. They are a post-COVID baby, so to speak, as we call them at the childcare center where I work. I've had some talks with the childcare industry, the early childhood education folks, because I've been invested in that for the last 4 years intensely. And we'll be moving on, but it has been an important part of my life. And education within what we think about as the best early education for children and the best parenting, all those conversations. And I haven't been totally satisfied with it, of course, from my perspective of where I'm coming from and what the perspective of is of the frontline workers, the administration, the universities, and their teaching of early childhood education, the kinds of publications that come out. And it's not very satisfying for me because it does not have the context of that image I just showed you, and that children are being born in a more and more terrifying world. And that really prepped in a big way for me in post 9/11 era. So won't go back to all that other than my dissertation itself between 2000 and 2003 at the University of British Columbia in the Department of Education, the Faculty of Education, was a study of the culture of fear and education and leadership and what is happening. So that was the surface of that dissertation, which I have right here, unfolded here. And when I was looking this morning, I thought I would start with this quote to lead off into the letters that I want to read to you today of real people, myself included, who are talking about children and where the world is going, and where children are going, and what children are having to deal with. And of course, adults with them, their parents, etc. But I have a quote on page 188A of my dissertation, a very complex dissertation I won't go into. It's called Fearless Leadership in and Out of the Fear Matrix, published in 2003. 22 years ago, I wrote this. The adult mind, quote, the adult mind is rooted in consensual paranoia, end of quote. That's not my words per se, but that is actually the words of Sam Keen, very important existential, spiritual psychologist, theologist, philosopher. Still alive today if you want to look up Sam Keen. He came from a book called The Passionate Life, Stages of Loving. It's a developmental view in his research of what the human condition, human nature, human potential could be. One of the best books I've ever seen. So I just gave you a quote there, and I'll give one more quote that's on that same page. It's actually in a collage art piece on the dissertation. Give you a quick glance at it. A lot of things in that image, and this is in the middle of a screenplay that I'm writing for my dissertation as part of it. And there's a quote by Andrea Dworkin, feminist, lesbian, back in 1976. So we're now dropping back a lot of years from Sam Keen. And they wrote, quote, fear cements this male supremacist society system together. Fear is the adhesive that holds each part in place. End of quote. So I'm starting there with this adult mind that comes into then having to be a parent, having to design curriculum, having to work with children, care for them, love them. The question is what happens to love when, if we followed Keen, if we followed Dworkin, and I have many others I could quote very similarly, including my own vision of what I've seen and what I've experienced. What I've articulated is in many publications, which you can look up if you wish, is that love is in trouble if the adult mind is fundamentally built on a consensual paranoia. Question is what happens to children. Question is what happens in a post-COVID world where so many people were in a consensual paranoia, a psychology of the pandemic, as I've called it, pandemic psychology, psychology of emergency. Just before I go into the letters, there's 3 letters I want to read, one mine, I have 2 responses to my letter. These are to colleagues today who, one has children, one works with children as a therapist. Before I go into that, I want to say that I do not think psychology is the only way to analyze what's going on. Let's just say children and families, parenting. And psychology is not the answer to the problem of what's going on with children and adults and parents today. Never mind schools and education and caregiving services for children and the mental health crisis that pretty much everybody, if you look around carefully, will tell you, yes, statistically, etc., but just by experientially that children are in trouble. And I know a lot of people would say, oh, the children are doing fine. And at some level, the children are doing fine. But of course, that's such a gross generalization, as is a lot of the generalizations I'm making, including the adult mind is built on consensual paranoia. However, I'm going to stick with that as a general orientation for this talk. I think it's a good critical perspective to take on education, psychology, where we need to go philosophically and all of the ways that we're going to have to try to find a new way in and out and through to basically prevent our children from falling prey to their own consensual mind. And I'm going to call it a dissociated mind as well in this set of letters that you will read. I'm going to read from a parent's recent story. And the story started when we were in a class together, and the colleague at some point shared their story. So they're kind of in their late 30s, brand new early family, right? Children are 3, 5 years old, something like that. And okay, brand new family, working professional, very intelligent, very spiritual kind of colleague here that I'm speaking to and about. I listened to the story in this particular situation. What became very clear was it's such an authentic story. It feels like it's a story that has that ability to be generalizable. Now, of course, it doesn't apply to everybody. No one story does, and everybody will have a different interpretation. But let me see if I can give you the gist of the story. They started sharing in an intimate space, and it was very vulnerable for them to share this, is that they go off to work, and every morning, 5 days a week, and they have to drop their children off at the daycare. He said one of the things that is so disturbing is I've noticed that when I drop my children off, I say to them, I love you. And then he said, but what I've observed since I've been doing this for months and months is the children never respond back, yes, I love you too. He said they actually turn away and look down. Now, this is coming from a very loving family and parent, very conscious parent. And so it's so troubling to this individual parent because it's hard to watch. And he says, what I'm seeing is that the children's experience does not match what I'm saying to them. And doesn't, what I'm saying to them is true. I do love them, but it doesn't match my experience that I feel incredibly guilty dropping them off at a daycare and going off to work. They're not happy. He sees that. They see it and know it too, but then the parent is saying, but I love you. See you at the end of the day. And by that time, the children, that's not their contract with the parent when they're that age. They want to be with their parent. They want to be with family, with people they know. And all of a sudden, he says they turn their head and then they walk off with the teacher at the daycare. It's a tough routine, and it's tough to really be fully aware when you're sharing this story. And so that will give you enough background to the 3 letters that I want to read now. And I'll stop at some points in the letters. They're not extremely long or anything, but they will give you a sense, and I'll articulate, some elaboration of this dilemma of exactly what this parent was going through and what does it do to the child. So he said in the story, as he was telling us, that the real painful part is I'm seeing my children dissociating. And they see that the reality of my words, the parent's words, are not real. It's not real for the parent. It's not real for them. And I would argue, this is a bit of a leap, hang in there. It's not real for the society we live in, of this psychology of terrorism, which I just showed you, the psychology of totalitarianism, of living in that kind of society that we've become fundamentally. Not totally, but it's pretty glim and dark as I see it. And I'm presenting here as Sam Keane presented it, as Andrea Dworkin presented it in 1976, a white supremacist society. Many other labels we could give to it, but let's leave those abstractions for the moment. So I wanted to write to this student at some point, and I did a couple days the next day virtually after we were in class together. I said, a very interesting subject you brought forward regarding your children dissociating. Example, as you leave them at the daycare and say, I love you, and they never seem to return it but look away and ... I hope at one point in the class, when I was joking with you about this incident, and I said to them, students, um, the children never signed that contract, what I said in a joke. Everyone in the class knew because they'd heard the story what that meant. And later in the class, I wanted to say that it was not a minimization of the pain of what a parent goes through. And I've been a parent, so that'll come through in the letter. But they never signed the contract. And adults think that because they sort of have a contract of responsibility built into them in having a child from the moment they conceive of having one to actually conception, and then the performance of birth, and then the performance of parenthood in a particular kind of society, they have, in a way, taken on a contract to the social good, and it's actually a legal contract that they are to care for that child, etc., etc., etc. Put them in school, right? Feed them, do not abandon them. Yes, there's an adult contract. The difficulty is that child never gets to coordinate, negotiate their powerful and empowered position and interests as a part of that contract. They're not a legal entity. And parents don't like to think of making contracts with their children per se, unless you get into behavioral problems and you start making little simple contracts like, if you do that, I will give you this on Saturday. You'll get a reward type of contract. But the contract of dropping children off at the daycare is basically a type of abandonment and to a bunch of strangers. And that's going to follow and be part of their life the next 12 years if they go to school every day during the week. So choice becomes erased for children very early, and that's what I call the foundations of a psychology of adultism, one of the oppressions of the many other kinds of oppressions that exist, from sexism to racism to classism to ageism and to adultism and fearism and so on. I continue the letter to this parent colleague. I have daughters 43 and 45 years old now, and like you, I was sensitive to read into their psychology of nearly every move they made as they grew up. And I had to let go of so many things I had no control over. I went through enormous emotional upheavals of my stable psychological and spiritual state because of my connection with them and the world they were entering. It can be very painful being so aware as a parent. I really get why many parents just go more or less numb or play out a role of patterns, addictions, to keep from feeling the painful realities of life for our little ones in this modern society that is not child-friendly for the most part. A lot of that addictions, by the way, I'm referring to is super busyness. That's not only just a psychological defense against what is happening with them and this abandonment with their children that's being played out as now normal. This is what you do as a parent because you have to work and you're professional, and both parents need jobs, and there's the lack of caregiving services and extended families, etc., etc. So part of the big busy, huge, super busy of parents that I see and I watch every day when I go to the daycare center, just look around society. It's not all hectic for children, but it is a lot of the time. And it also keeps parents away from feeling and really experiencing with the child, experiencing when you are with them. I rather would argue that Our little ones typically experience existential threat daily, especially as adults. Example are political leaders who ignore the measures required to secure a sane, healthy, ecologically sustainable future for them, the children. Sadly, for so many adults in capitalist civilization, this is a dissociated game they are playing. Children's perspective is ignored. They're compromised. They are compromised in their future, moment by moment, in a non-issue characteristically as adults run around. It's a non-issue. The children's future is compromised for the most part. They do their own thing. Children are dragged around more or less in the adult thing that they do. I'm very aware when the new president of the United States was elected, it's not the first or the only president of such grievous, illegal actions to not take care of our climate, global warming, and to come in as a president and be elected is horrifying when basically they are said, spoken, outright climate denier, that the humans, as far as they're concerned, have no impact on climate, and don't worry about the global warming. It's all mostly a hoax made up by a bunch of liberal leftists, queer, strange people who don't know what they're talking about. Listen to me and what I'm talking about. I will tell you the truth. They are lying to you. So that president is persisting on that. And I think any child who is so aware, and parents aware, that climate is declining in its habitability. In other words, the future is becoming very precarious very quickly. And there's not a lot of, quote, hope for a long, healthy future in this environment that we're creating, and choosing not to stop that deterioration. I'm saying children experience an existential threat daily. How do they experience it? That's very fine-tuned. We would have to do a much finer talk on that. Look at assessments, look at research. But I'm suggesting already, arguing, they are feeling it philosophically and spiritually and psychologically, that they are not welcome here on this planet. Because the planet, the way it's operating, under these adults, under this consensual paranoid mind, is completely fear-based, with slight exceptions, creating a toxic and deteriorating environment for life. If you are life, child, you pick up, this is a threat. It is toxic. My parents, I can see it in them. I can feel it in them. Even before you're born, you pick it up, the toxicity, the distress of parents, the abandonment that is awaiting you, putting you in a daycare or just keeping you at home. The parent isn't fully present. They're on their phone. They're taking you for a walk by the ocean, as I watch in the baby carriages, and the parent's got a dog in one hand, a coffee in the other hand, holding on to somehow this baby carrier, and then they've got their phone headsets in and on at the same time. The child is under existential threat of abandonment of life. Life is being taken away from them in their future. Okay, continue the letter. I share this context now with my colleague. I share this context of my own experience and my existential and philosophical reading of what is going on for children's lives. And I would say approximately that children are confused, first and foremost. Unconsciously, for the most part, that confusion. And that can play out as a part of the dissociating complex. So this is why my colleague said, I see my children dissociating. It's awful because I know dissociating is not healthy. And I practice all kinds of spiritual practice because I don't want to dissociate. And that's why I do spiritual practices. That's why I'm doing a dissertation in spirituality and education. But what I make the distinction is, share with the colleague, there is a distinction between those processes of dissociation with the confusion. That's right on top for children. Mixed messages is another way to put it. Confusion of who's running the contract. How come I didn't sign the contract? And then you say you love me. I make a distinction between those processes and the notion of dissociation. So there's dissociating and dissociation. I would agree. His children probably are indeed dissociating. And that can become severe, it can become pathological and become a full-blown dissociation process. Dissociation, as this distinction I'm making, itself is a pathological complex, and one that is based, this is really important, on hurt and hurting. That is, on storing of an unhealed painful memory. That's also equivalent to trauma. Hurting. That is not being healed. That is the worst we can do with children, is hurt them, i.e. through an abandonment experiencing, then turn that to ignoring that they're experiencing that. They never have a chance then to fully express their feelings, their concerns about not feeling a member of this contract, and they start dissociating. But what they're doing is they're turning away from you. And that turning away from you, when you say, I love them, this would be the example in this situation, they're saying, I'm not accepting your attention is adequate right now to what I am feeling in being abandoned. And I can see you're going to leave anyway. You're going to say, I love you. You're going to feel your guilt, but you're taking off anyway. You cannot process and help me process what I'm going through. And we know some kids, as soon as the parents are starting to leave, whether it's dropping off at the daycare, this happened in grade 1, 2, 3, some early grades, they'll cry, they'll scream, they'll go incredibly depressed. They will feel really confused and actually panic. And eventually they'll get used to it because it's going to repeat and the parent's still going to drop them off anyway. Because the system, capital S, works that way. And the child's being cracked down and carved up from their natural tendency and knowledge and instinct to be with the ones they love the most and trust. They're going and being, quote, thrown out into the world of others on a massive scale, not just a friend or two from the neighborhood, from the tribe, community. No, they're going into an industry of child care. Anyways, I say in the letter, this idea of a syndrome of dissociation is what we ought to be most concerned about. And through good parenting, you can help that child heal through, and you can heal through. It takes both to do the healing work. And that's a more complex conversation. So the dissociation syndrome, the pathology does not set in between the child and the parent, but let's just speak for the child point of view, that they do not become enmeshed in a dissociation from reality. And they will. Now, I'm not just talking about fantasy as the defense against reality, but that is true. A lot of children's fantasy is not just cute. Oh, they haven't developed their cognitive skills, so they fantasize a lot and they think it's real. No, that's partly there. They're a different mind than the adult mind, for the first early years especially. But that children are actually realizing they have to live in both worlds, both minds, the adult mind, the child mind, adult's world, child's world. the industry of childcare, schools, etc., they have to realize that they're split. They're being split. The realities experiencing as a whole is being split constantly. And they are confused of how to negotiate that split. And I don't doubt why that would be incredibly confusing for children. So confusion could be good and put into creative use, again, with good parenting skills, good education skills, all the caregivers, the mediators who receive and work with children. But if they don't get that, the child doesn't get that. And the child might also have genetic predispositioning to be a very fearful, shy, non-communicating child. That makes it even harder for them. In other words, they're not easily communicating. They're communicating, but much more difficult compared to a child who can communicate more quickly, verbally, and clearly what they are after, what they want, what they need. There are children who don't have those capacities for lots of reasons, and there's many. And then there's adults, of course, that don't have those capacities. And so you got lots of gaps for miscommunications, discommunications, distrust, mistrust, confusion. And that can lead to further pathologies showing up that turn into what we call mental health disorders. Anyways, this morning I was thinking curiously if you were going to bring this experience of your children into your research work. And that's another topic. P.S. I say, I finish this letter now. I never, that I can remember, told my children, I love you. They were children of a divorce very early at the ages when one was 3, one was 5. A horrible divorce. I was distrustful of the word from the start as a parent. This is before the breakdown of the marriage. I was still distrustful of the word that I'm going to go around and tell my child, I love you, I love you, I love you. I don't remember ever saying that and doing that. And I basically had the rationale worked out in my best of experience and intelligence because I had studied childhood development for a long time. I studied parenting. And I was also a critical watcher and thinker. And I was raised in a home where somebody said, I love you all the time. And the message didn't match the reality of how I saw they treated me, how they put their addictions first before their attention on their children. They were self-centered and narcissistic. They were very wounded. They were very dissociated most of the time. I was distrustful of the word from the start and chose to radically trust that I would be true to myself, true to reality, and thus children, my children, would get that message. They school teacher. And if I went around saying, oh, I really love you, I believe in you. I acted so as to be in my reality with them, the closest I could bring that about and interpret that, act it and perform it. And in the end, as I say in the letter, in the end, it was up to them, the children, the students, whoever it is, they will decide, if not judge, if I love them or not, if I cared for them or not. We put that in there too. I half jokingly end the letter. The jury is out on what they, my children, students when I was a school teacher, my clients when I was a therapist, what they actually think about that. Maybe I'll ask them at some point, my children. Well, my children have told me many times over the years of, as they grew older, of course, all the things that they didn't think I was so good at as a parent. This colleague now responds, Dear Michael, thank you so much for your message and sharing with me your insights on parenting. I think you are right. It can be tough to be a parent and be very aware, but it's also equally tough and unsettling to no end to be not aware and know that I'm probably not noticing everything I'm doing to my children. My children have a similar age difference as yours. They are 5 and 2. And then he jokes, going on 3. I try to comfort myself for my shortcomings by telling myself that one day I will own up to the mistakes I made with them and may be helpful to their healing of any damage I may have caused them. Great. The great thing as a parent to be able to have that insight. In fact, I will name my mistakes that I think I made even before they do. This seems like the right approach for now. I agree when you said, quote, I rather would argue that our little ones typically experience existential threat daily, especially as adults. Example, our political leaders ignore the measures required to secure a sane, healthy, ecological, sustainable future for them. My son talks about Trump and says he wishes, so we're talking about the 5-year-old here. My son talks about Trump and says he wishes he could beat him up. When Trump won the election, my son started tearing up. I don't remember talking too much about politics around him, but no doubt, I guess he could feel the fear we felt in the house around the election. And this individual and his family are people of color, and that's not a great thing to be in America nowadays as a person of color. I try to comfort him and tell him that he doesn't need to worry about Trump and that everything will be all right. Yeah, I can see why you'd say that. And part of me says, that's not going to be any different than the message of abandoning children at the door of the daycare and saying, I love you, everything will be all right. Yeah, everything's not all right. The child wouldn't have said when Trump got elected, he wouldn't have felt when Trump got elected, and starts to tear up automatically hearing the news or watching the event, whatever is happening in their home. To say the least, children are incredibly sensitive and intelligent. I try to comfort him and tell him he does not have to worry about Trump and that everything will be all right, obviously, because it's not a weight he has to carry at this point. Yeah, well, good luck with that, my friend. Seriously, it's a great thought. We all think that as adults, that children are not going to have to carry this weight or that weight of the world, that parents' duty is to do that. Children will get reality, quote, and the weight of the world soon enough. Existentially, and at this deep philosophical level I'm going to, they're already carrying that weight. They pick it up. They also take incredible responsibility for life because they are life. That's how life exists. Life exists because it takes and carries the duty to live. That's a weight. That's a challenge in a world filled of entropy, never mind all the toxic destructivity of modern technological, digital, virtual civilization. Children are born into this existential threat every day. Some potentially incredibly overwhelming. But children have devices, parents have devices to buffer that intensity, which is a good thing. We have to buffer intensities. So I'm just saying the weight is there. How we deal with it with children, that's a much complex, more detailed conversation, but that's course. And the third letter I'm going to read is some wonderful suggestions from this therapist who works with children. The colleague then ends the letter. My parenting guru is Gebar Mate. He's the Canadian doctor, very psychiatric, intelligent, individual who works with very troubled and addicted people, but is very popular out there. You may have heard of him, but I cannot follow all of Gabriel Mate's recommendations. I'll give some thought as to how this topic may come up, the topic of my children, quote, in the future for him. Thanks very much for this conversation. So the response, I was having a conversation with this colleague who's a therapist, and they shared. Oh, I thought I ran it off. I guess I see I don't have it here. Oh. Okay, I thought I ran it off. I can probably remember what they said. The therapist said that one of the things you have to do is actually make a contract. And it works really well when a child drops off. So this therapist has seen many children dropped off at the hospital who have to stay under care because they worked as a art therapist. This colleague has also seen many dropped off at their counseling clinical office. Same thing. Child separated from the parent for a moment. Therapist has to be with the child, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So they have tons of years of experience working with this same dilemma of this, what I'll call the abandonment cycling, and what it brings up for children, parents, and of course the caregivers who are receiving the children. They basically said it's really most important for especially young children to not necessarily say I love you. This therapist advised in the letter to me that that typically does not work and creates that kind of extra distance and dissociating process of the experience because it's not mutual between the adult dropping and the child being abandoned at some level. The passing, right, of a child under the care of one to the care of another that is a stranger and even a professional, and even in a setting that is, in some sense, I find the clinical settings, whether it's a hospital, a dentist's office, or whatever. As a child, I just found them terrifying. I didn't like the smell of them. I didn't like the sound of them. I didn't like the way the people moved and the coats and the uniforms they wore. I can remember it. I was terrified of getting vaccination needles. Scared the shit out of me. When it's not horrible, but why did I have such an intense, deep fear? And then I found my mother has that same intense, deep fear of these kinds of caring professionals, and especially psychiatrists. But that's another story. The thing you can do best, this therapist said, rather than saying, I love you, bye, good luck, is to do everything somatically and make a contract with the child, even at the very earliest age, when you think you can have them have that exchange. And you use your body. So it's called somatic attachment, bonding, and carrying that through distance of time when, yes, the parent disappears outside of the room. And the somatic bonding is you just meet the child with your body and you have some little signals that you agree that are between you and the child. So you do this before you get to the therapist, before you get to the daycare, before you get the drop off that's going to bring up stuff for them. It's going to be unconsciously fear, right? Distress. And then the parent's going to get distressed because the child's distressed. So they actually agree this is going to be distressing. This is how you would communicate it somehow. Everybody can do this uniquely, unique parenting, unique child. And you give some somatic cues. And so even the simple is, okay, when we get there, we're going to do a high five when we're ready to go. And or we're going to do something else. We're going to do a little song and dance. We're going to sing something. We're going to pass this object from me to you, and you'll give it back to me when I come back. Notice all the touching, somatic, arts-based, irrational ways of communicating, not the quote, rational language of, I love you. See ya. Good luck. All right. That would be a whole longer conversation. I'll look for that letter and may share more details from it, which I can't totally remember all of them, and put it in the comment box. That's enough for today, and look forward to conversations further on this whole business and this whole incredibly sacred relationship and the confusion that that creates for children and for adults, parents, and society. We have a lot of confused people in society because of mistakes, not doing it the best we could. So I'm here to help that problem, along with a lot of others, of how to improve moving beyond a fear-based way of being with children. Thanks for today.